Okay, so it's Saturday, September 22nd, 2018, and we're interviewing Mike Wu, the famous Mike Wu, very famous around Silver Lake.
Formerly, yeah.
Right? No, really. I'm Cheryl Revkin doing the interview. Marco Larson's on the camera, and some other people from the committee are here, Debbie, Jenifer, and Maureen. Thank you so much for granting the interview. I'd like to start with your family and your background. I understand that your father was born in China, is that right?
Right,
Mm-hmm.
right. Actually,
Tell us a little.
sure. I'm a native of Los Angeles myself. I'm the first member of my generation of our family born in the United States. My father was born in China, but we learned only a few years before he passed away, although he was born in China, he was actually born a U.S. citizen because his father, who also was born in China, also was a U.S. citizen because his father, in other words, my great-grandfather, was a U.S. citizen. So while I used to say that I'm the son of immigrants to this country, actually that is not completely accurate because of the law that enables someone who is born to someone who's a U.S. citizen to become a citizen. But my father is from China.
Whereabouts?
Guangdong province. Mm-hmm. My father was born in a little village called Ngaomaoleng, which means Cow's Hair Hill, which is a little village about 2 hours away from Guangzhou. My mother is also of Chinese descent, but she was born here in California, born in Stockton, California. And after she graduated from high school, her parents sent her back to China so she could see what the real world was like. And it was there that she met my father. My father went to a boys' school. My mother attended a girls' school across the street from each other in Guangzhou. They fell in love. They got married. My two older sisters were born in Hong Kong. And then along came the war. At the time, nobody knew how long the war was going to go on. And the women in our family all stayed in China where they thought it was safe. The men in the family came back to the United States here to Los Angeles, and then the war broke out. And so for about 4 or 5 years, there was literally no contact between my mother and my sisters and my grandmothers and the men in the family who were here in the U.S. And after the family was reunited after the war, about 6 years later, I was born here in Los Angeles.
Was there anybody born after you?
Yes, I also have 2 younger sisters born after me.
I see. Mm-hmm. So I'm just curious, how was it that your great-grandfather was able to become a U.S. citizen? That must have been in the 1800s.
That's right. We don't actually know. We don't know much about great-grandfather. There's an oil painting of him over at my parents' house in Monterey Park. We know a little bit about his involvement in farming. But other than that, we don't know that much. And we only learned this about the history of the men in our family having been born as U.S. citizens a few years ago as a result of an exhaustive document search through old files in a warehouse in San Bruno, California, where old records of my father's original trip as a baby to the United States from some interrogation of his mother, my grandmother, that was done at Angel Island, which was the detention center in San Francisco Bay where travelers from China were routinely detained. And so there were some documents there that accounted for the facts of our family history as they were reported to the immigration officials at Angel Island around 1920, when my dad made his first trip to the United States as a little baby coming. But until then, we didn't know. And I'm sure my father knew, but he never really brought it up or went into any detail about this. So we only discovered this a few years ago, but we haven't been able to uncover other parts of the story. I'm hoping that my younger sister Elaine, who for many years was an obituary writer for the LA Times, I'm hoping she'll find the time to actually do some detective work and try to figure out some of this.
Yeah, very interesting. And you said your mother and two sisters stayed in China thinking that it was safe.
Yes.
But it actually wasn't safe,
well,
right?
it's
During
hard.
World War II.
Right. It's hard to recreate what the atmosphere was like at the time, but what I was told was nobody knew how long the war was going to go on. There was a history of aggression of war between China and Japan, but apparently our family didn't think that the war was going to go on as long or it get as bad as it did.
Especially in China.
Yes, there were a lot of stories in our family about the women in the family were basically all staying together. So there were two grandmothers, there was my mother, there were my two older sisters, and they ended up having to flee from Guangzhou, where my mother's mother had a house, to Hong Kong, basically fleeing in advance of the Japanese army. Then when the army came into Hong Kong, they fled to the village where my father had been born, where my father actually hadn't lived there since he was a little baby. My mother, although she was of Chinese descent, she grew up in America. So for her suddenly to have to live in this village with two baby girls and well, not just no men, but like no electricity, no running water, and the threat of invading troops. I heard there was some story about my mother running into the woods, basically nearby, with the two girls on her shoulders to basically escape from the troops. So there were a lot of melodramatic stories like that.
And she had a lot of sort of fear of the Japanese that carried over, do you think,
Yeah.
to her life here?
Oh, well, no, I don't think it really carried over to here, because I guess there was a big difference in terms of perceiving of being in wartime situations compared to LA. And to some extent there was a lot of interaction between Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans in the produce market, because our family business was a wholesale produce business down in a part of downtown LA that used to be called City Market, around San Pedro and around Olympic or 11th Street. And
around what year was this?
Starting in the, I think, late 40s or early 50s.
Okay,
my dad and my grandfather bought a wholesale produce company, and at that time, then, like now, the wholesale produce business was a logical business for immigrants to buy into, and a lot of Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans went into that business because there was a kind of a supply chain in terms of farmers who were Chinese American or Japanese American who could then sell to the middleman, the wholesale produce businesses, who could then sell to, in our case, to Chinese restaurants, Chinese markets. So there was a whole supply chain. Plus, just like today, you don't have to have a lot of English language skills to run a successful food-related business. So if there were farmers who were Chinese, if there were buyers in the form of neighborhood markets or restaurants or others, that was a good business for immigrant families to go into in terms of not having to have all the kinds of support and connections you have to succeed in business outside. So just to answer your question, I think there was actually a lot of interaction between Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans who were in the produce business in those days.
I see. And that's where your father really started out.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, actually for decades our family business was called Chungking Produce Company, and my dad went there every morning, like around midnight or 1 or 2 in the morning when they started, and they would close at about 9 o'clock in the morning. But it was a family business in the sense my grandfather also worked there, my mother was the bookkeeper there, my Uncle Henry worked there, and so for decades, basically that was the family business. I didn't ever actually work there, I think because I saw how hard my dad worked, and I did not want to continue in the life of, getting up in the middle of the night and going to work.
Did your father have ambitions for you? That you knew you didn't want to work in that business?
Well, I have to say that to grow up as an only son in a traditional Chinese American family is a very favorable place to be. So probably yes, there were expectations and a lot of support and encouragement.
To do what?
Well,
anything you wanted?
I'm sure that my dad would have been happy if I had followed his footsteps and gone into business, but it wasn't really my interest, and I discovered lots of other things to do. But also there was another side to our family, which was that my dad was very active in the Chinese community, the Chinatown community. My dad was the national president of what was then the earliest Chinese American civil rights organization nationally, the Chinese American Citizens Alliance, and was very active in a lot of local organizations. Our family association, that's an association in Chinatown that theoretically consists of members who are descended from the same emperor. Not emperor, ancestor. Ancestor is the word,
okay.
Not emperor.
Might be an emperor.
Well, yeah, but not in our case. But in theory, all members, everybody who has the Wu surname or the Chan surname or the Yun surname theoretically are descended from three brothers who are descended from the same ancestor from a long time ago. So when Chinese immigrants came to the United States, since so many of them came from the same part of China around Guangdong province, and actually from two adjacent counties in Guangdong province, the blood relations became the basis for social organizing, in the sense that immigrants who came here not knowing anybody, not having any connections, not having a place to live or a job, would first turn to their family association in terms of people who, in theory at least, are your relatives who might be able to help you find a place to live or to get a job or to get started. So these institutions were created not just here, but in San Francisco, New York, many other cities where Chinese immigrants gathered. So my dad and my grandfather were very active in an association called the Jihao Oak-Tin Association. Plus the fact that my father, who grew up in China, actually as a boy, basically migrated back and forth several times, but he, after attending the first 2 years of college at Lingnan College, which was one of the first Western-style colleges started by Western missionaries in China. After 2 years at Lingnan College, he transferred here to UCLA. And then graduated from UCLA and liked it here enough to want to settle down here. And so my father was completely bilingual. In other words, since Cantonese was his initial dialect, he was completely fluent in Cantonese, and since he went to school in China, was completely fluent, in terms of reading and writing. But because he spent so much of his early life living here, he also became very fluent in English, and that meant that then, later, he played a role as a kind of an intermediary between Chinatown and the outside world, interacting with people like Councilman Gilbert Lindsay and public officials, the former county supervisor Ernie Debs. Since my dad was bilingual and had good connections and credibility within the Chinese community, but could easily communicate with politicians and other community leaders, and just my dad's personality. He was very outgoing. He liked to join organizations. He belonged to service clubs, a Lions Club, things like that. So in some ways, although my dad's identity was completely that of a businessman, but he was also very active in the community. So as I was growing up, it became natural for me to think that it's natural for somebody like my dad, goes to work around midnight or 1 or 2 in the morning, works till 9 o'clock. And then after 1962, my dad's career changed. He was invited to help start up Cathay Bank in Chinatown, the first Chinese American bank, even though he had no background in banking. He knew nothing about banking, but they asked him to help start the bank because he had very good connections to the community because of his business relationships and because he'd been active in so many community organizations. He had a lot of credibility with the community. So then my dad started leading what has been called bankers' hours. Like around 9 o'clock in the morning, after spending the whole earlier morning at Chungking Produce, then he went to the bank. And starting with a storefront on North Broadway. So it was, the first Chinese American bank. And they started in a storefront and eventually built their first building on North Broadway. And now they have, branches in many cities across the United States and in Asia. But that was the next segment of my dad's career from, for decades. And then, but that meant that after he continued to work at Chungking Produce. So he would do that till about 9 o'clock. Then he'd go over to the bank. Then he'd stay there till about 3 o'clock. And then he would, I heard he used to take a nap. And then the community part of his life would start, because usually there were, dinner meetings, evening meetings, things like that he had to do. So that was, and so for me, as a young person growing up, I thought, well, that's normal, and that my mother was also active in the community. My grandfather, of a different generation, but he was also very active as well. So I think I grew up with the expectation that, this is the kind of life I should lead too. I didn't know exactly doing what, but at least that way of balancing some kind of private life with some form of public life or community life, to me, I just thought that was normal. Isn't that the way everybody lives?
So your father kind of supported
your
ultimate career.
Yeah. Even though, he was really different than I am in the sense he was a very conservative Republican. He was because Senator Richard Nixon, when he was a senator representing California, had done a favor for our family. At that time, it was very difficult for Chinese women to migrate to the United States. And my father's mother was still in China, and so my father sent a letter to Senator Nixon, who he didn't know at all. This is in the early 50s, and asking for help because there was a procedure by which a member of Congress could introduce a bill to specifically exempt an individual from the immigration restrictions, and a bill was passed. And then after that, my grandfather, as a sign of gratitude, sent a crate of china to Senator Nixon to thank, because that's what you did in China if some high official did a favor for you. And Senator Nixon sent the crate of china back, with a letter saying, "Sorry, I can't accept this because it's I was just doing my job." And so after that, my family. Especially my father and my grandfather became very enthusiastic supporters of Senator Nixon because obviously he was a man of utter, integrity. So that plus there were historical reasons. Most Chinese Americans were very dedicated Republicans because the Republicans were much stronger supporters of the anti-communist Chinese government than the Democrats were. So that was that plus probably another part of it was the fact that our family was very business oriented and the Republicans were much more business oriented. So all these things basically came together, but this all shaped the earlier generation, but I came around in the 1960s in a very different time, a very different political context. So it was interesting that my dad, who was a very conservative Republican, still was very supportive of me, even though my political views evolved into a very different direction than his did.
I see. So you went to high school in
Alhambra, right.
And that was
That's
Chinese community?
Yes. It wasn't then, but we were one of the first Chinese families to move from the Crenshaw district out to Monterey Park around 1962. At that time, it wasn't quite what it has become now. At that time, there weren't very many Chinese families moving out there. So we were one of the first families to move out. But it was as a result of something that my dad worked on. In the mid-1960s, that's when my dad was the national president of the CACA, the Chinese American Citizens Alliance. And he used to, one of the issues that they cared about was changing the immigration laws to get rid of the restrictive quotas, especially on people coming from China and Asia in general. So my dad actually, he came back and talked about how he was testifying before some committee chaired by Ted Kennedy about immigration reform. And in 1965, that bill finally passed and was signed by President Johnson. And that's what then played a key role in opening up the doors, not just to immigrants from China, but Taiwan and the rest of the Chinese diaspora across Southeast Asia, so by the 1970s and 80s, Monterey Park really changed, and the whole San Gabriel Valley started to change. But it wasn't really like that in 1962 when our family first moved out to Monterey Park. But that's why I went to Alhambra High School, because we lived in Monterey Park.
I see. And so in high school, did you experience any discrimination or any racial bias?
To tell you the truth, not really. That is, I wasn't very conscious. If it was happening, I wasn't very conscious of it. Now, there were some things that were starting to happen, I think in the 1970s, not the 1960s, in Monterey Park, in reaction to the influx of Chinese and Vietnamese American population changing. In Monterey Park, for example, there was a big backlash to business signs that were in Chinese only, with proposed ordinances at the local level to ban signs that were not in English, and a very angry debate that went on that had to do not just with the signs, but the signs were only on the surface. It was really about what is our community, who lives here, who is this community for. My perception is that wasn't really bubbling up until more like in the 1970s and after. In the 1960s, there weren't really enough Asian Americans, I think, to generate much of a reaction.
And so then you went to college.
Yes.
After Alhambra High School.
Right.
Cal State LA.
No. Well, yeah. Cal State LA was my. I went to summer school there I took an introduction to California government course taught at Cal State LA while I was still at Alhambra High School. Right. It was like a summer school course that I took. It was intended. I think at that time Cal State LA tried to make it easy for high school kids to sample what college would be like. So that's how I did it. But also, our house was very close to where Cal State LA was located.
They still have a program, actually, of allowing kids in high school to start college then. So then you went to...
UC Santa Cruz.
UC Santa Cruz, right. And what was your major then?
Well, it took me a while to figure that out. But I went to Santa Cruz in part because of the kind of university it was then considered one of the experimental campuses of the UC system. Also, frankly, I wanted to get away from LA. I was tired of being around here, wanted to try something different, and Santa Cruz was appealing to me because it was utterly different as a campus located in the middle of a redwood forest, but still close enough that I could take an inexpensive PSA flight from San Jose Airport back to Burbank to come home for the weekend sometimes. So I went to Santa Cruz, and
when you figured out your major,
it took me about three years to get to make a decision, because I tried out different. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I thought maybe I might want to go into journalism or law or something like that. I didn't really know, but at this time, between 1969 and the early 70s, it was at a time when our country was going through what was then called the urban crisis, not just in the aftermath of the Watts riots in 1965 here in LA, but also in other cities. There were issues going on that on one level had something to do with race, had something to do with poverty, it had something to do with tensions between groups. But as time went on, I gradually discovered that thinking about the city, not just Los Angeles, but about the city in general, was a way to combine a lot of the interests that I had. So politics was part of it, but architecture, the sociology of the relationships between different ethnic groups, the role of cities as vessels of culture, and just the idea that you can do a lot of things, you can experiment with a lot of things in cities that won't happen anywhere else. And I thought, well, this is really interesting. And so I ended up majoring at Santa Cruz. At that time, an undergraduate could actually create his or her own major. So after trying out some other majors, I ended up creating a major called Politics and Urban Studies. Oddly prophetic in terms of what I ended up doing, but that's what I ended up with. And so ironically, in my case, it took moving to a college in a redwood forest in order to discover that I was really interested in cities. And that's what eventually led, I ended up creating a course at Santa Cruz about why Americans hate cities. I ended up, one of my mentors was a professor named Paige Smith. One of you saw the drawing of the chicken out there. That was by Paige Smith, who, in addition to being an historian of the American Revolution, a biographer of John Adams, and the author of a book about the small town in America. He was someone who loved small towns and hated cities, but he became my main mentor at UC Santa Cruz, and so even though we didn't look at small towns and cities the same way, that helped start me on my way of thinking about the places where people live, and so that process eventually led to me deciding to apply to graduate school in city planning at Berkeley.
Berkeley, I see. And was city planning kind of a new field at that time? Or?
No, it wasn't really a new field. It was new to me, and I have to say I wasn't really aware of what it was about. I mean, I was reacting more to the words more than what planners actually did. And when I first landed in graduate school at Berkeley, my initial thought was I made a mistake, that this is not right for me. And the more I was learning about what city planners do, the more it made me think, this is actually not something I want to do. This is not why I picked city planning. Maybe I was too naive, but I didn't know what I was getting myself into. And so after about 6 months, I found my way. That is, after about 6 months, I became comfortable with it. It was a matter, just like at Santa Cruz, of finding professors I wanted to work with. And so all through my college years, I found that the way that I could thrive would be if I found professors who I really liked and or respected and who could help point me towards things. So on one level, if you look at my college career, it looks like a lot of zigzags, and things that don't make a lot of rational sense. But that was largely because I developed a habit of looking for mentors and finding people who could point me in the right direction and people who I liked working with. And so that's what I ended up doing at Berkeley. In the case of Berkeley, the chairman of my thesis committee was a man named Jack Kent, one of the founders of the city planning field in the United States, but also, coincidentally, a former planning director of San Francisco and a former city councilman and mayor of the city of Berkeley, who, in other words, was in a perfect position to help me make the connection in my mind between politics and urban planning, because he had done it in his own career. Another one was Alan Jacobs, who was the planning director of San Francisco for 7 or 8 very tumultuous years, but who taught me how to look at cities, how to understand what makes a city work from the micro level of benches, street trees, things like that. And years later, after I was on the city council, and an architect, Martin Myers, suggested we should widen the sidewalks on Hollywood Boulevard as part of the redevelopment process in Hollywood. I asked Professor Jacobs to come down here from Berkeley, come be a consultant to the redevelopment agency, tell me what we should do. Barton Myers says we should make Hollywood Boulevard like the Ramblas in Barcelona. I'm not sure this is a good idea, but what do you think? So we brought Professor Jacobs down here. He spent a weekend in Hollywood. He walked the whole length of Hollywood Boulevard from the Roosevelt Hotel to Western Avenue or Vermont and back, doing the same thing that we used to do in graduate school, which is look very closely at what's going on the street. And then after his investigation, he said to me, no, don't waste the money widening the sidewalks. Your sidewalks are perfectly fine as they are. But, he said, what you need to do is design the hell out of it. That is, the width of the sidewalk is not the problem. The problem is that it's ugly around here. There's not enough of interest to pedestrians. So street lights, benches, trees, signs, historical signs. Well, there were already the stars there, but you could do something with the stars, telling people what are the names of these people you don't recognize. Who are these people? So he said, you have a lot to work with, but he said it would be an utter mistake to waste the money tearing up the sidewalks or putting a median in the middle, like in Barcelona, that you could walk down, that Barton Myers had been to Barcelona, thought it would be wonderful to translate this to Hollywood Boulevard, but Professor Jacobs persuaded me, no, that's a waste, and so we didn't do that, and the benches and the trees and the lights that you see on Hollywood Boulevard basically came out of that. So.
I see. Okay, so then you came back from graduate school and decided.
I didn't come back from graduate school.
Oh, sorry.
I worked my first job out of graduate school in 1975. Was working for a nonprofit organization in San Francisco as a one-man research department on the subject of youth unemployment. Why do young people have a hard time getting jobs? I did that for about 6 months, and then I was offered a job in Sacramento working for Senator Roberti, whom I had first met when I was at Santa Cruz. I did a student internship in his office right over here as his assembly district office on Rowena Avenue.
Oh my God. Wow.
That was his district office. And so this goes back to around 1970 when I was about 19 years old, and that's when I first got to know him. After I finished graduate school and working in San Francisco, he offered me a job working in Sacramento, and that became an apprenticeship for me, learning about how government works. So I learned how to write bills. I learned how to communicate with lobbyists or reporters. I learned how to suggest ideas for new state laws. So I did that for about 4 years, and that after about 4 years, that led me to the conclusion I could do this job at least as well as the people who I see around me in the state capitol. But because I'm an urban planner by training, and I'm actually a lot more interested in local government than I am in state government. So right around this time, I started thinking about moving back to LA and getting active in politics, maybe running for office. And this coincided with a time when there was a lot of turmoil in Hollywood.
I see. You can fill in if I'm kind of jumping too far, but I was really curious how you made the decision really to come to Silver Lake, because you were from kind of Monterey Park, Alhambra, the Chinese community, and there wasn't much of an Asian community in Silver Lake, and there had been some restrictive laws.
Yes. Well, it's true that there wasn't a large Asian American population in Silver Lake. On the other hand, there was definitely a historical thread. There were definitely Asian Americans, especially Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans, who lived here because this was one of the first neighborhoods outside of the ethnic enclaves like Little Tokyo or Chinatown where Chinese could actually buy property. So going back to Delbert and Dolores Wong were old friends of my parents.
I was going to ask that question.
Yes.
Because we interviewed Marshall Wong and he
yes.
told us
well,
about buying a property.
There are lots of connections. So while it is true that I never lived here, and later I once joked with my dad that, if only you had made the decision to buy a house in Silver Lake instead of Monterey Park, my later political career would have been much better. But I was only 11 when the decision to and he said the reason why they chose Monterey Park was because there they could buy a new tract house compared to buying an old house in Silver Lake. So, I think reflecting the culture of the time, it's much better to buy a new house somewhere than to buy an old house and have to do what I've had to do here in terms of fixing the plumbing, and water leaks and stuff like that. But I felt comfortable with Silver Lake partly because there were friends of the family, like the Wongs who lived here. One of my dad's best friends was the Chinese-American architect Eugene Choi, who lived over here on Castle Street. When I was a teenager, I used to want to become an architect, partly because my dad and I used to go visit Eugene Choi's house over there, and I started to get me interested until I realized that I would have to have math skills and drawing skills that I did not have. And there were other friends of the family around this area in Los Feliz, Silver Lake, and Echo Park. So while I had never lived here, because I knew people here, and in addition, culturally, it felt comfortable to be here.
In what way?
In the sense that there was diversity here, there was openness to different groups. I perceived Silver Lake as an area, in addition to Hollywood, as being an enclave for the gay and lesbian community, although I'm not gay or lesbian, but it was one more sign of diversity here. The kind of businesses that existed then along Sunset Boulevard, and there were some interesting problems, like the tension between Latinos and the gay community, leading to the rise of Sunset Junction street fair and things like that. So it was kind of that plus the architecture was interesting to me too. I first moved here in 1980. By 1983, I decided to become a homeowner, to buy something, and it was a fascinating process. Suni Lim took me around to see 30 houses, including some of the landmark houses designed by Schindler and Gregory Ain that were on the market in 1983 for relatively low prices. I was particularly fond of some of the Kesling houses over here, above Silver Lake Boulevard. I forget what street, like one up the hill from Silver Lake Boulevard on the
Occidental?
Yeah, up around Westerly Terrace or Easterly Terrace?
Westerly Terrace is off of West Silver Lake Drive, Easterly Terrace.
Yeah, Easterly Terrace. But I opted not to buy any of them, even though it would have been a steal, I think, and there were several on the market. But many of them were not in good shape, and I made the prudent decision that it was less risky to buy a house like this one that didn't have the architectural cachet that the other houses did. But this house was very solid, clearly very well built, well maintained, and that plus this particular neighborhood, Suni persuaded me was the right place to be. Well, it was very stable. And she said it will always be like it will never decline. This is a really good buy, and the fact that it was only 2 blocks away from the reservoir, and because there wasn't a view of the reservoir from here, it probably made it a little more affordable than a place with a great view. And I didn't really care about the view. I wanted to be close to the reservoir, but I didn't need to have a view of it. So that's how I ended up here.
Okay, and then so when you moved here, did you have the intention to get into local politics in Silver Lake or
in 1980? I was thinking about running for the city council, and so I ended up becoming a candidate in 1981. That was my first race for the city council that I ended up losing, like Peggy Stevenson. So I was running against her and did well enough to force her into a runoff, but I lost the runoff. But after that, I decided, well, I like being around here. I think I'll stick around. I don't know what's going to happen. By this time, Roberti was in the state senate, and he offered me my old job back, but instead of working in Sacramento to work in his district office over here in at Crossroads of the World in Hollywood. And I said yes. And at that time, I didn't know what I wanted to do, but if you recall, I actually had not lived in Los Angeles from the time that I graduated from high school in 1969 until I came back in 1980. From 1976 to 1980, as a member of Roberti's staff, I actually did make frequent trips back here and started to work with groups like Hollywood Heritage on the preservation of the old Jane's House, the last remaining Victorian house on Hollywood Boulevard. Started to work with the Sierra Club on some issues relating to the proposal from the city to add a landfill to Griffith Park. So I started to get active in some local issues while not living in Los Angeles, while I was living in Sacramento, but I had the good luck to be able to work on some big issues, some of the early proposals for the Metro Rail system.
The light rail?
Well, no, the heavy rail, which at that time was still the Wilshire subway, and a proposal. Senator Roberti asked me to get involved in the dispute in the Hancock Park area relating to the location of a subway station at Crenshaw and Wilshire Boulevard that was opposed by neighbors in the area who said that they thought putting a subway there wouldn't be used by local residents, and it would only be mass transit for criminals and gang members and drug dealers coming into Hancock Park, so they didn't want it. And, yeah, and now there's going to be one, but this is back, in the late 70s, and so I had an opportunity to get involved in a lot of issues like that and to meet people in the area and to work with people on issues that people cared about. So that's what eventually led to me coming back.
Right, I see.
Coming back may be the wrong word in the sense I never actually lived here in Silver Lake. But it's interesting. I mean, coming back to a question you asked me a few minutes ago about the race relations in Silver Lake, I found after I became a candidate running for the city council, I spent time every day, hours every day, walking door to door to meet neighbors all over the district, but also in Silver Lake. And frequently I found people, homeowners in Silver Lake, assumed that because I was an Asian American, that I must be one of those former straight A students from John Marshall High School who went to John Marshall with their kids. And although I never went to John Marshall High School, nor was I a straight A student, but that there was the positive side of the Asian American stereotype actually helped me in Silver Lake. I mean, I didn't go out of my way to say that I did not attend John Marshall High School because people just made this assumption about me. Because at the time I was 29 years old. I looked like somebody who their sons and daughters went to high school with, so must be. But in other parts of the district, such as East Hollywood or the flat areas of Hollywood, there was a very different kind of reaction. And for me, the experience in other parts of the district, basically the backlash to my ethnic identity was an eye-opener for me because I'd never ever experienced this before. Not when I grew up in the Crenshaw district, not in Monterey Park. Sorry. Not in Monterey Park, not in Alhambra, not at Santa Cruz. I never ever really experienced this until 1981, the first time I became a candidate for public office. And it was an important lesson for me because while I think I was a little naive, assuming that, well, this is Los Angeles, it's a heavily Democratic area, I'm a liberal Democrat, I used to work for the state senator here, I ought to fit right in. And I realized that at that time, and not just then, but also years after that, there are these tensions that largely have to do with economics. That is money. That is money or the lack of money that causes people's attitudes about race to be affected. This is something that I've experienced more than once and I can go into it more years later, but at that time, for example, one time when I met an elderly white woman at the door of her apartment in East Hollywood, I had a standard 30-second pitch I would make. I'd introduce myself at the door. I had a computer printout with the name of the voter, the address, the party registration. So I knew a little bit about who I was meeting, and then I would explain that I'm a candidate running for city council. And this woman started to ask me whether I would support reductions in Social Security or other kinds of benefit programs. In other words, she couldn't, even though a city council member really doesn't have anything to do with Social Security, but that was her way of asking, are you with us or are you with somebody else? And how can I trust you? Tell me if I can trust you to do what I need. And then she made some other comments about the Armenians and Iranians and the Mexicans moving into her neighborhood in East Hollywood, which, of course, I had nothing to do with directly, and I would, if I were a council member, I wouldn't really have any. But again, it came down to trying to figure out: is this a friend or a foe? Is this somebody who would be an ally or somebody who would be against me? Can I count on you to be a supporter of rent control, or are you going to support landlords?
Wasn't there a sanctuary city issue back then?
Well, there was discussion then, but it wasn't until after 1985, when I was elected to the city council, I had made a promise during my successful 1985 campaign to some sanctuary activists that I would support declaring LA to become a sanctuary city. And then after I won the election in 1985, they came back to me to say, remember, you made this promise, why don't you do something about it?
Yeah.
And so I said, okay, I did promise, I'll do it, not quite realizing that this was going to become the first hot issue that I would ever deal with on the city council. I think that political advisors probably would have advised me to not do this as the very first thing that you do after you get onto the city council. And I think I didn't quite realize how hot it was going to get. I mean, I knew that it was somewhat controversial, but it became an extremely hot issue, especially after I demonstrated that I had the political skill to put together the votes on the city council to get it to pass. But then one of my council colleagues, Ernani Bernardi from the San Fernando Valley, threatened to put the whole thing on a citywide ballot referendum, which I, of course, immediately knew would succeed, and that in other words, at the beginning of my first term on the city council, that I would be stuck with what would likely be an extremely embarrassing and politically costly defeat, and perhaps permanently branding me as the father of an extremely unpopular measure, which then led me to reverse direction and initiate the repeal of the ordinance that I had fought. It wasn't an ordinance, it was just a resolution, but to repeal it, but keeping in place the police department policy about not questioning people about their citizenship status. So I was able to keep some of it, and it was useful to the extent it was actually my first time testing out whether I could put together votes on the city council and provide leadership on a controversial issue, but I didn't want to go down in flames over this. So I think I was able to show that I had some political skills, but also that I wasn't going to commit suicide over something that wasn't meaningful.
Can you kind of maybe summarize how you set yourself up to be better for Silver Lake than Peggy Stevenson?
Well,
what the political
Peggy
dynamics
Stevenson hadn't done that much in Silver Lake, although I think that many or most of the neighborhood leaders in Silver Lake supported her against me because of a sense that at least she was an incumbent. Her chief deputy, Newt Dieter, lived in a house a few blocks away from here, so he was in Silver Lake. She had pretty good relations with the owners of gay bars in Silver Lake, but on development issues, some neighborhood people felt that she was too supportive of real estate developers in Silver Lake.
And you were kind of anti-mall.
Yeah, right.
Malls.
Yes. The mini malls became a cause célèbre for me, although I think I came along 4 years or 8 years too late to really deal with it. There was one case on Sunset Boulevard in particular where basically I forced the owner, the developer, to change the design of a mini mall. But by 1985, many of the gas stations that could convert to a mini mall already had converted. But that was still, for me, a useful symbolic fight, because it basically was a way for me to say to developers and architects and others that I want you to do things differently than you have done before. But anyway, so Silver Lake ended up being one of the neighborhoods in the district where I ended up getting a lot of support.
Yeah, you kind of built your support around the issues that became very relevant to
Right.
Silver Lake residents.
Yes.
Right. And
Also around that time, don't forget the malathion spraying.
oh no, I did forget that.
Yeah, that was
Tell us
that
about
was
that.
well, that was another issue where, as a member of Senator Roberti's staff in his district office, I was able to work with anti-malathion activists, largely in Echo Park, not to some extent in Silver Lake, but that was another very hot issue around then.
Well, wasn't there spraying at the reservoir? Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so I know there are a million more details, but you decided to run for mayor at a certain point.
Yes.
Right. From your Silver Lake residence, you
Right.
really stayed in Silver
Right.
Lake all of this.
Right, and I was planning, if I won the election, I was going to stay here and just use Getty House for ceremonial occasions, but I was planning to stay right here.
Well, Eric was planning to stay in Echo Park, I know, and ended up not really being able to. But really, there's something about this area of LA that I think is very attractive to political candidates who want to live here and kind of extend their influence from here, I think. So there were riots in LA. You were kind of involved in that issue.
Yes.
There's everything from malathion spraying to Sanctuary City to
Right.
so many issues. And basically you put yourself out there as a liberal, Democratic liberal. Didn't Bill Clinton endorse you for mayor at some point?
He did. He did. I first met Bill Clinton in the Hollywood Hills
You did?
because Mickey Cantor offered me an opportunity around 1991 to ride in the back seat of a car with Governor Clinton as he was riding from one fundraising event to another. So I had a chance to meet him for a brief 10 or 15 minute conversation as we rode around in the back of his car. And
Did that kind of inspire you more to stay in politics, run for office?
well, this was during my second term on the city council. I had been reelected with a resounding 70% of the vote.
You really won people over.
Yeah, and I was starting to think about running for mayor. I thought that that Mayor Bradley might decide to retire, which would then mean that it would be the first time in 20 years that there was actually an open race for mayor without an incumbent. And going back to when I was in college and thinking about things like city planning for the first time, part of what had inspired me was actually thinking about Mayor Lindsay in New York and learning about what local leadership could do in the case of racial tension between groups. Mayor Lindsay used to go into Harlem or other areas that were really torn by tension and calm things down. And so when I was a college student, these images had a very influential effect on me, not realizing that a few decades later that I would be in a leadership position in Los Angeles during a very tense time, in 1992. But even before that, the Latasha Harlins incident, in which a young African-American woman was shot to death by a Korean-American store owner in South LA. So I found myself getting drawn into some of these citywide issues, and as the only Asian American on the council, dealing with an at least three-way dispute between African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and whites. So actually a four-way dispute. There was a role for me to play, I found. And then, if you add on to that, the issues relating to police reform, which yes, I became the first elected official in City Hall to call for the chief of police to resign, and that had an effect. I mean, it was risky. I ended up making the decision to do it one night in April. I think it was April 1992, the night before my wife and I were about to file taxes, and I was at dinner with my accountant going over the tax returns that had to be filed the next day. But at the same time, I was talking on the phone with my political consultant, Steve Glazer, who is now a state senator from Northern California, but who was then helping me figure out, is this the right thing to do? If I'm going to do it, how should I do it? And we ultimately made a decision the night while we were doing my taxes that I should hold a press conference at 9 o'clock the next morning to announce this. And that ended up having an enormous effect on my career. It probably won me the undying enmity of certain people, but also opened up doors for me in some ways. And even today, decades later, it's amazing that sometimes when I'm in public gatherings with African Americans of a certain age, I get recognized much more than if I go, say, to an Asian American gathering, because it was like a kind of a enormous symbolic event that took place that for those who were politically involved or paying attention to what was in the LA Times then had this enormous effect. And I actually, in the mayoral election in 1993, I ended up getting a higher percentage of the African American vote than I did of either the Asian Americans or Latinos in Los Angeles. And so it was something I didn't plan on, but I was in the right place at the right time,
it just strikes me that, first of all, you're very self-reflective. You know, you kind of really think about who you are and where you want to be, kind of express that. And also that you seek out very kind of wise people as mentors, which I think is such a great quality. And also that you have an amazing amount of confidence. I mean, that you could kind of take on really being a kind of mediator among these different communities and do a really good job of it. I mean, did you feel more confidence after that? Did you feel, proud of yourself?
I think that actually I felt more confidence to a degree, but also frequently wondering, what am I getting myself into, what's going on here? Because sometimes in those kind of situations, you don't really know where things will lead. I have very vivid memories of what it was like to be in Los Angeles during the riots in L.A. and things that I saw, things that I experienced, the smell and the smoke in the air, things like that still feel very vivid to me.
Vivid in a frightening way, or vivid?
Some of the images I think are frightening, like seeing men carrying knives, tearing holes in the awnings of downtown, outside businesses in downtown LA, or seeing a homeless man set fire to a pile of garbage by the 10 freeway exit around Arlington. There's things.
Still, I mean, seeing all of that, you were thinking I could be the mayor and be responsible for all of that.
Right.
You were willing to kind of take that on.
Well, I needed help to do it, and you're reminding me, there's some things that I did that even now I still remember, like when I finally decided, okay, this is my opportunity, I'm going to give up everything and run for mayor, I asked a couple of people to come meet with me to basically put on a kind of a one-man tutorial for me of what do I need to know. Like I asked Warren Bennis, who was a business professor at USC, a former president of the University of Cincinnati, who wrote many books about leadership, to come talk to me about what could a mayor do. I asked Ed Hamilton, who I'd read about when I used to read about Mayor Lindsay. As a young man, he had been Mayor Lindsay's deputy mayor, and now here he was a management consultant in Los Angeles. And I asked him to come meet with me for an hour to talk about who do you think are the best mayors in the United States, and why? Yes, and why? What is it that could be learned from seeing? So we spent a very fascinating hour, basically, with Ed Hamilton, who's now at that time he was in his 50s. In other words, it was like 30 years after he'd been a deputy mayor in New York, talking about, since who knows the mayor business any better than Ed Hamilton, to have him do essentially a one-man seminar for me about what do you need to know about being a mayor.
I'm sorry, let me stop a minute. How are we doing with time?
We're about 52 minutes.
52 minutes, so we've got just,
Okay.
we have to make these
Okay.
hour-long interviews,
Okay.
I'm sorry. Well, that's fascinating. I mean, do you have any longings or regrets or anything about getting out of politics and into academia?
Well, you're asking this question in a very kind way. It's sort of like when some school children went to visit President Kennedy and they asked him, "How did you become a war hero?" And his answer to the school children was, "I couldn't help it. They sank my boat."
Yeah.
And so in my case, I basically was out of public office after I lost the race in 1993 for mayor.
To
And
Riordan. Right?
yes, and so I had to reinvent myself. And so since 1993, I've done a number of other things, some in the nonprofit sector, some, for about 7 years, I taught the undergraduate introduction to urban planning at USC. I decided to get interested in climate change, and I ended up getting a consulting job trying to correlate land use and transportation decisions to climate change impacts. And then the job I have at Cal Poly Pomona is not something that I was aiming for, but it came about because about 10 years ago, I went to a Christmas party at an architect's house, and an architecture professor from Cal Poly Pomona, who I knew a little bit, asked me if I'd be interested in applying for the job of being a dean. And I'd never really thought about it, but I applied, and it took about 6 months, but I ended up getting the job. And so now I've been there for, this is my 10th year now as the dean, but I continue to live here in Silver Lake, and I commute back and forth, and I try to find ways to get involved in things that I think are interesting. Last night, for example, I went to Assemblywoman Friedman's public meeting in Glendale about the future of autonomous vehicles. And I'm thinking about how I can turn this into something that we'll do at my school. I'm thinking of teaching a class next semester called Disruption and Design, and to try to understand the future in terms of things like autonomous vehicles, Uber and Lyft, these ubiquitous scooters, electric scooters that we see on sidewalks around the city, and to try to figure out what does this mean in terms of, are we not going to need parking structures or parking lots anymore, and what should architects and planners and decision makers know about the future. So that's still generally my approach to thinking about trying to understand what's going on in the world out there.
And also you've been involved in affordable housing.
Yes.
Maybe in a few minutes, can you just explain why you got involved and how you see resolution to the issue?
I'm not sure I can say how I see resolution to the issue, but one of the jobs that I had after I left the city council was working for a nonprofit organization that raised money from banks and provided low-interest loans to nonprofit developers of affordable housing. So I did that for several years, and for me that was an introduction to learning some things about the development process, and especially the process of developing housing. However, I'm feeling very pessimistic in general about what's happening in housing. I had to give a talk at UCLA a few months ago that I titled it "The Housing Debacle," because I think that the housing market doesn't work anymore. That is, we are falling further and further behind in terms of producing the number of units needed to accommodate the growth in our population that's expected. And we could spend a whole hour talking about this. There are a lot of things that need to happen, but basically I think that each part of the city has to take on some share of the responsibility. It could mean that in a residential neighborhood like this, we may need to look at some things that may be unpopular with some people about building so-called granny flats. It could mean in some cases where there are homeowners getting older in houses that are larger for their actual needs, that is, that there are bedrooms no longer occupied by their children. Maybe we need to find ways to encourage vacant bedrooms to be occupied by other people who could take advantage of being there and could help out the elderly residents as they get older. So there are things like that I think we should think about, in addition to looking for ways where there are vacant lots, where there are opportunities. For example, at a place like Hollywood Presbyterian Medical Center, where I used to be the chairman of the governing board, at one point the owner of that hospital said, why don't we build a shopping center on the parking lot here, because some people, family members visiting their relatives in the hospital, might want to break and go shopping. I suggested to him, wait a minute, if you're willing to do some building on your parking lot, why don't we put some housing here where your nurses or your doctors or your medical staff, some of them might actually want to live within walking distance. At that time, the owner of the hospital just laughed at it and thought, you can't be serious. But actually, I think there are opportunities like that, especially where there are jobs concentrated in certain places. So it's going to take, I think, an enormous commitment to address this. Otherwise, people will just live further and further away. Families are going to spend ever higher percentages of their monthly income on housing. So I think things are going to get worse before they get better.
Well, let me end by saying, first of all, thank you so much.
Sure.
It's been so illuminating. But also, if at the time that the issue maybe comes up in Silver Lake, I hope you'd be willing to have a talk at the library with
Sure.
people about this issue and about the responsibility of the
Sure.
community. So,
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
okay, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.